Alrighty, welcome to the BIOS lab. In this particular lab, we are going to be doing an examination of the BIOS on the ThinkCentre M910s. Now, the BIOS and UEFI are commonly going to be mixed together in terms of where they're described. In a lot of cases, the UEFI and BIOS are described as the same thing. However, UEFI is a newer, more advanced variation of what the BIOS was. It does include the features of the BIOS. One of the big things, obviously, being able to do the power on self-check. You can kind of think of the BIOS like the old styles of car keys. They started the car and they had minor security. However, UEFI, or the Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, is more like that modern key fob, the one with those buttons on it, the ability to open, automatically start, or possibly turn on the car alarm. So in a nutshell, the UEFI is just more fancier than the older style BIOS. And inside of here are some different settings and things that you will need to be able to set and configure. The UEFI is also going to change what we can and can't configure inside of it. So in this case here, when this machine starts up, I've gone ahead right now actually and just interrupted the startup process. But we'll go ahead and we will continue it just so you can see by pressing Control-Alt-Delete on the keyboard. As long as the control is still with the BIOS, it will allow it to reboot. You will see in the lower left-hand side, oftentimes, or the upper portion of the screen, it will let you know what key you can use to interrupt or to cause it to do something else. In this particular case, you're going to notice that it's going to try to boot to a network connection. And that's kind of what we're seeing here. We're seeing that the media test failure, that has nothing to do with the drive itself. It is strictly just an issue with the ability to boot over the network. We're not booting over the network, so that's not really a concern of ours. And it will keep rebooting and doing the same thing over and over and over again. So when the machine starts up this time, we can go ahead and we can press the Enter key to pause the boot process. And we've gone ahead and we've continually pressed the Enter key until we paused it. And you'll see at the bottom there, it'll actually start counting down. If you press Enter a second time, it will pause it. That way we can have a second to read what we have available to us. The fact that we're trying to get into the BIOS setup utility where we can do configuration, it's going to be pressing F1. And we can just press F1 immediately versus pressing Enter instead if we wanted to get there right off the bat. Or we can press F12 for the temporary startup devices. And from there, similarly, we can also press and go to the BIOS setup. So BIOS setup can be entered by pressing Enter, pressing F1 directly, or by pressing F12. And then from inside of here, pressing the Enter Setup section. So inside of here, there's some settings that you can perform. The first thing is looking at the main screen. We can go into the system summary. We can see all those devices that we set up and configured. The one big one, obviously, being the fact that we have the ability to view that our processor has been recognized correctly. We can see how much RAM has been recognized. So if we have multiple sticks, we can make sure that's all showing up. We can also see what graphics card is being used. In this case here, we're using the integrated graphics. We can see that there is a CPU fan installed, but there's no additional fans, and that matches up with what we've installed to the computer, as well as the fact that we have one hard disk, and that hard disk is currently installed into the SATA 1 connection on the motherboard. If we were to have connected our hard drive to a different interface, then we would actually see it come up in a different spot. Since we only have one SATA device plugged in, we only have one SATA device visible. So that system summary is a great place to verify that our computer has been built correctly and that if we've done service, that everything is connected correctly. We can go into the system date and time. By default, it should be correct. However, it's possible that it may not be correct. And you might have to adjust that. If we had disconnected the CMOS battery from the motherboard, oftentimes this date will return back to what's referred to as Unix epoch time. So you may have to reset it from there, but that's not really too big of an issue. Easy fix, simply by just pressing in the information. Here is all you need. So right now it is 4 p.m. So 4 p.m. in Army time or 24-hour time is 1607. So 16, enter, 07, enter, and then we can just press enter like that. And today is indeed the 4th, so we can leave that alone. So going backwards, we can go under devices. This is an area where we can do configuration for specific devices on the motherboard that are integrated. So in this case here, the ability to, say, for instance, enable or disable USB ports could be an important feature. If this desktop was inset into a secure area and only the front panel USBs were available to the user and we wanted to disable them, simply coming in here, selecting a device and selecting disable could be something that we could do. Along the bottom of the screen, you'll actually see that we have the different help keys. So we can see we have F1 for help, escape. It's kind of like a little diagram or a little menu that lets us know about what's available to us to use to get around. On the right-hand side of the screen, when we're in a menu, we can actually see help information about the thing that we selected currently. And then when we press that enter key, as you previously saw, you have the ability to pick the different options that are there. And that will change as we go through all the different menus inside of the computer. You'll also notice as well that our mouse I actually moved earlier, and the reason why we have the ability to actually use our mouse is simply because it is a modern day BIOS, which, as I mentioned before, is referred to as a UEFI-based system. So we have mouse support. In the older style ones, we didn't have mouse support and you could only use the keyboard. And frankly, I find the keyboard easier to maneuver around, so that's actually what I'm going to be using going forward. Some other things that you can configure inside of here, for instance, in video, right now it's set to auto, but if you wanted to, you could specifically configure it to just the integrated graphics, because we know I don't have a graphics card installed. And it allows us to get access to some more settings that weren't necessarily available when it was configured as auto. If, say, for instance, we had our own separate audio card or network card, we could simply come in here and actually disable stuff like that. Like, for instance, that speaker that's on the motherboard, we can disable that so that it will only use an external speaker, and then we won't have that speaker built in the computer. Or, for instance, we can remove our ability for our network adapter to be present. So continuing on, some other settings that could be of use or possibly might be of benefit, for instance, would be the ability to turn on and off virtualization support of your hardware. If you're trying to run VMware in a 64-bit virtualization, you will need to enable hardware-supported virtualization of your CPU. And that's typically done from inside of the advanced area and selecting CPU settings. Some other important features or some things that might be of benefit, for instance, would be like this one. After power loss, the ability for you to enable your machine if it lost power suddenly, how does it get returned? Is it going to return to the last state that it was on? So if the computer was on and I unplugged the power cord and plugged it back in, it would return to being back on. I could tell it just to stay off, or I can tell it to power on after a sudden power loss. So different things like that are available to you. This next area in security could also be of benefit as well. In some systems, you do have to configure an administrative password before you can change anything. Now, if you've entered into the BIOS and it asks you for a password and all the options are grayed out, then that's something that you're going to have to reset. And that's done by using the jumper on the motherboard and then powering your machine back on again, waiting a few moments, and then powering it back off after you've heard a few beeps, moving the jumper back and then turning it back on, and you'll actually find that you now have the ability to work with the settings inside of the motherboard. So we can see at the top of the screen there where it says not installed, that's just representing that there isn't a password configured. So we don't have an administrative password and we don't have a power on password. If we did set a power on password, for instance, we could describe that the power on password is required for the machine to reboot or to power on, or similarly, we can actually even configure the administrative password, for instance, when I want to update the BIOS, or if I wanted to press F12 to select a different boot option. So there is some security. And this particular desktop, for the matter, actually has a lot more settings than you would normally find in your typical retail computer. Now, one of the other settings that we're going to want to configure or make sure is disabled is secure boot. By default, if you have secure boot enabled, your machine is not going to be able to boot to removable media unless it's formatted in FAT32 or it's been created using an official Microsoft installer media creation tool. So coming in here, we verify that it is disabled. And then we can go to the startup area. In the startup area, checking out the primary boot sequence is going to be the first place we're going to want to check. And before we actually even go in there, our media that we're going to be installing is going to be utilizing UEFI, and it's not going to be utilizing a drive formatted for MBR or a master boot record. It's going to be using a drive that's formatted for GPT, which means that we can have UEFI only enabled. We don't need to leave the boot mode as auto. So we can go ahead and select UEFI. That's going to ensure that we don't have anything weird happening when we select our boot media. And we can even go ahead and turn off the compatibility support module. And that's going to ensure that our boot media does boot correctly. And if it hasn't been set up correctly, it won't boot. Going into the primary boot sequence area, we can see a bunch of different devices in here. Now, what we notice is there's different categories that these devices could be set as. So for instance, we have USB key, USB FDD, SATA 1, M.2, we have PCI Express drives. Now, if we look at the right-hand side of the screen, you're actually going to notice that there's plus and minus to move the device up or down from this particular list. So I have whatever I have selected, I press plus or minus and it goes up or down. Now, if I was to say, for instance, select a device that I didn't need, like USB FDD, a lot of people think FDD stands for flash disk drive, but FDD is actually floppy disk drive. So we're not going to use that. And in order to get rid of it from our available boot options, we're going to press the X key. As mentioned on the right-hand side, X is to exclude or include devices from the boot order. So we don't need the USB FDD, so we can remove that. And we can perform that action with other devices that we don't need. Like for instance, we don't need these interfaces, we don't need the additional SATA, we don't need the networking. And we just continue through until we remove everything that we don't need. And then we can rearrange our options based on how the lab describes. Now, this isn't saying this is how it's supposed to be, but I'm just setting it this way. Now, one thing to note is that if your USB devices are higher than your hard drive, it will always attempt to boot to those. And if you have something plugged in that is bootable, then it will boot to that first and could possibly provide an error message on the screen. And if that happens, one thing that you can look at is unplugging anything that could possibly be booted to, or booting to the BIOS and checking out your boot sequence. So right now, the only device that I actually have and that I want to have is my hard drive. And we can see how SATA 1, and then we have the device that it's actually being recognized as. If I had a USB key plugged in, it could either be recognized as USB key or as USB hard drive. A lot of times it is USB key, and in this computer, I believe it does come up as USB key. But it's always important to have both of those if you are trying to boot to USB media, or if you want to have a USB CD-ROM drive. Now, one thing that's special about this computer is this include exclude. If you exclude something from the boot order, it doesn't have the ability to boot to it at all. That's including even using the temporary boot options. Now, if I was to rearrange this, for instance, and I put the hard drive at the top of the list, and I went into the temporary boot options, I could then select the USB hard drive as an example, or the USB key, or the CD-ROM drive before the hard drive attempts to load. But if I have it the other way, it will always boot through the USB devices first, then to the hard drive. But if they're excluded, then that means it's not available at all. So that's just something to take note of. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put this back the other way, just for the time being. And then continuing on to the very end. At the very end, after we go to leave, if we were changing things, we would want to save changes and exit. If we were just observing, just looking around, always want to make sure that we're discarding changes. That way, in case you have changed something by accident, it's not going to cause any issues. The only real exception to this would be if you accidentally disabled secure boot. Oftentimes it will clear the keys out from that. So the only things really you want to make sure that are set for your machine at the very end for Windows installation is to go into security, making sure your secure boot is disabled. Go under startup, making sure that the CSM is disabled. That will automatically configure your boot mode as UEFI only. And then making sure that you are configuring your primary boot sequence and not one of the other boot sequences, so that your hard drive is one of the available boot options and that your USB keys are in the included boot menu, not the excluded boot menu. So we can go ahead and save and exit. And at that point, you can go ahead and plug in your USB key if you're installing Windows, and you can go ahead and install your Windows operating system now. If you don't have anything plugged in, what we're going to see in a second probably is we're going to get a little pop-up that's going to tell us that no operating system was found and that we know to then go ahead and plug in our USB key that's bootable.